Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Jennifer Walinga, and I'm a professor in the School of Communication and Culture at Royal Roads University. Welcome to our webinar series, Sport, Leadership, and Social Change. This is episode 14, and we're going to welcome the great Duff Gibson, who we've named our episode after, the Tao of Sport, his book that he's just recently released, and I was lucky enough to read. What a joy. So I'll tell you more about Duff in a little while, and we'll get to know Duff and ask lots of questions and get engaged in his many stories he has to share and such wisdom. But I'll give a little bit of an overview of the webinar series and introduce you to its background, but also where we are at in Victoria, BC. We are on the lands of the Walinga and Kusepsin people, also known as Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations communities. Our campus is very privileged to operate on these unceded territories. And we're always so grateful to acknowledge the lands. We embrace the lands fully as a university learning community. And we know we have a responsibility to acknowledge the truth of our history in Canada, and also to work with responsibility toward reconciliation. And of course, acknowledging that truth is part of reconciliation. I personally spent a lot of time also on the Wasanich territory, rowing backwards in a little skinny boat on Elk Lake. I was out there this morning, and it certainly did not look like that this morning. Raging wind, torrential rain, but always a pleasure to be out in nature. We spend a lot of time embracing the lands, as I mentioned, and we are operating on a campus of 300 hectares of old growth forest. So many of our programs take advantage of that, including these young students from the environmental science program. But it's so important to acknowledge the value of the ecosystem that surrounds us. I think it's another lesson that I learned through sport and try to embrace each morning as I get out there rowing. I also like to highlight another feature of our campus that we emphasize within our School of Communication and Culture. And again, another principle I learned definitely through sport, and I'm sure Duff has experienced this as well, the idea of minding and bridging the gaps. Before you can build a connection with someone, whether it's a formal structural bridge or a shared understanding or a hug or a handshake, really you have to understand each other and the differences between each other, embrace that diversity before you can bridge it and leverage it and build something unique together. And in our School of Communication and Culture, that's our mantra. Begin with the diversity and then begin to build those connections. This webinar series is all about sport, and I believe sport is the answer to most issues in our world. But we've definitely seen sport take on a very powerful leadership role. And we see that in many ways across all the programs and initiatives that sport has spawned, but also all the ways that the athletes, especially I found recently in our Olympics and Paralympic Games, the way that the athletes told stories and spoke up on important issues and found creative ways to use their platforms, even with the Rule 50, to use their platforms creatively to speak out and challenge assumptions and push for values-based leadership in our world, not just in the world of sport. We're seeing athletes take the stage in remarkable numbers right now across our sports system in Canada as well. And my hat goes off to them. At Royal Roads, we have a number of different schools, and they are divided into key discipline areas that all connect interdisciplinarily and interdependently. And I find these mirrored through sport as well. Sport has many organizations that reflect what we value at Royal Roads. We have programs in humanitarian studies and development. Definitely, we embody the principles of diversity and inclusion in all of our programs. We have a School of Education and Environment, School of Humanitarian Studies, Culture and Communication, Leadership, Business, and a Leadership Health program. We have Media and Communication, of course, and our goal is positive social change, transformation. Our tagline is life.changing, and we believe that if we can experience and foster transformation personally, we're able to better equipped to foster transformation within our communities and within others. We also have a number of partnerships that I am definitely fostering here with my love of sport. We connect with Game Plan, and it ties in so beautifully because Game Plan is all about supporting athletes throughout their career as athletes, but also as they transition out of sport and into professional careers. And at Royal Roads, we actually acknowledge your elite sport experience internationally and at that high level as credit. So in much the same way that we acknowledge professional experience, professional learning from different contexts, we also embrace the learning that professional athletes have gained. I often think, oh, hi, Wynn, good to see you. I often think that my sport experience was like another degree, a degree in sport for sure. And I continue to learn from sport every day. And we're also building sport programming at Royal Roads in leadership governance. And we have a course called Sport for Society that's offered as, these are all electives right now, but they'll form a little grad cert eventually. I'm just working on that last course, and that can then ladder into any one of our master's programs. I'm currently operating in a partnership with the CFL Players Association, and I'm actually right in the middle of a course with a number of their players and hockey players and sport enthusiasts from all different sectors, but it's mostly a partnership that was born with our connection to the CFL. And so wonderful to be working with leaders in sport who are looking to develop their skills. And so our webinar series was born during COVID because we wanted to continue to connect with our communities. And I had always had this little seed of an idea that I'd love to invite sport leaders into our space. And so we thought, what a great opportunity. And here it is 2 years later on episode 14. We have one every month. I love it. It's been really fabulous to keep fanning that fire, really. And here we are to episode 14, the Tao of Sport. This is the name of a recent publication by Duff Gibson. Duff, this is a few things from his lengthy resume, but he's an Olympian from 2002 and 2006. And I just have to say, in 2006, it was when I had shortly after our third child. So he was just at that point where he understood the Olympics, and we are sport fanatics in our household. So he really had no choice but to really enjoy, because they were on 24/7. But it was so cute to watch this 4-year-old boy embrace the Olympics. He was sprinting up and down the hallway when anything fast like skeleton was on. I remember him shrieking at the top of his lungs to tell me that curling is on. And, such a good reminder of the joy that sport can bring to everybody, but to see it through this little boy's eyes was absolutely phenomenal and brought me right back to why I love it so much. Duff is a multi-medalist on the World Cup circuit and a world and Olympic champion in skeleton when he discovered his sport. And I mean, he's a multi-sport person. A national team coach for many years, captain of Calgary in the Calgary Fire Department, and founder of Dark Horse Athletic, which I'll get him to tell us more about during this time together, and also author of the Tao of Sport, which again, I was privileged to have an early copy. So we'll talk lots about all of these things and share lots of different stories, I'm sure. I want to, though, ask everybody who's participating today to pose questions in the chat. And for those who watch the recording, we always record these and post these to our website and share them out broadly across all our networks. I know lots of people will be enjoying this after the fact, and so it's tough to participate, but you can always share a question with Duff on Twitter or send something along to me and we'll connect you up. But please feel free to post questions at any time. We will monitor the chat. And I also love seeing, people sharing where they're coming from and what lands they're on and how they found their way to sport. We love having all these channels operating at once. Don't worry, we're used to it. We've been an online university for 25 years, so no news here. And finally, lots of connections and opportunities to connect in other ways. And if you'd like, and if Duff's cool with it, I'm sure you could DM on Twitter, but if he wants to share other information at the end, that'd be great. We have another episode that'll just be a recorded one, and probably another one later May that'll be coming up as well. So let me stop sharing there and let's get down to business. You can always choose your view and how you would like to see Duff. So make sure that you can pin him or change your view to speaker or whatever you prefer. And Duff, let's get started. So I always like to start by asking you to introduce yourself a little bit more, but kind of through the lens of sport. Why sport? Why do you think you're still so devoted to it, still writing about it, thinking about it, so involved? I mean, really your career, definitely you're in, firefighting as well, but you've been involved in sport in so many different ways for your whole life. What's that all about?
Well, if there's two or three different questions in there, in and around there. Why am I still involved in sport? Is because no one ever. It was taught to me originally. There was never any external reward. It was go outside, be outside. We had lots of kids in the neighborhood. We played hide and seek. We built skateboard ramps and jumps for our bikes. And probably what we did more than anything was play street hockey. And there was never any prize. There was never any belt or trophy. And we played for hours and hours for no reason other than we loved it. And we did it. We would have an argument, as many kids, people my age can relate to, as to who got to be your local NHL team and who got to be, when I was a kid growing up in Toronto, we would argue as to who got to be the Leafs, even though they were terrible. And then the other team, as a consolation prize, got to be the Islanders, who had won 4 Stanley Cups in a row at that time, or Gretzky was just coming along. And it's very strange now to see Gretzky turn 60. Well, I'm 55. And when I was a kid, I pretended to be someone who was barely older than myself. But I'm still doing it because no one took the fun out of it. It was never made into a job for me. It was never a labor. It was always something that I loved to do. And so that's for sure why I'm still involved. Something, if you want to, you and I only know each other through email and social media. And so you might not know about me that my wife and I adopted our 2 sons from Ethiopia. And so, diversity, I'm involved in a few different committees through my work. I'm involved presently with the Human Relations Committee through the Calgary Fire Department. And part of what our job was to come up with a land acknowledgement and understand when that was appropriate and what how specific we wanted to be and what message we wanted to give to firefighters about this honor that we have to serve every member of our community. That's sort of the angle that we approached it at, because it's a lot of people will, my biggest fear, relating to Black Lives Matter, for example, or diversity and inclusion relating to hockey, but both of my sons play hockey, is that someone will use a tagline and that'll be it for them. And when I see an NHL player, I'm going completely off in a different direction here, Jen. But when someone says, someone was, called the N-word in a hockey game, or someone, one of the Leaf players had a banana thrown at him years ago, and someone says that's unacceptable. Well, if that's where it ends, that's heartbreaking to me. And so the psychology of it and that sort of thing is really important. It's something, it's a complete, that'll be book number 2. And I hope we can have that conversation about it in the future. But you took the time to do your acknowledgement of where you're speaking from. And so I want to acknowledge that I'm in Treaty 7 territory in the city of Mohkinstsis, which is the Blackfoot word for Calgary, and most of southern Alberta is Blackfoot, and that is I wasn't prepared for this, so I'm going by memory. That's the Siksika Nation is a Blackfoot, part of the Blackfoot Confederacy, as well as the Piikani and the Kainai, and Calgary is also right beside the Tsuut'ina Nation and the Stoney Nakoda Nation, and and the Métis Nation Region 3. So those are all the subcomponents, but it's really Blackfoot territory. And I have a friend named Riley Manybears, and he is a very elite long distance runner, and he's part of the Siksika Nation. And I have been invited there I was able to take one son and my wife, and we met with elders and we talked about residential schools, and we had some really heavy and yet beautiful conversations and had a smudging ceremony, and it was very interesting. I think that you could revamp the education system and be very successful and get huge buy-in because it's such fascinating history to know that the Tsuut'ina Nation and the Stoney Nakoda Nation came from the south, and they spoke to the Blackfoot Confederacy and said, "Can we be here?" And it's yes, and that's existed for, I don't want to speculate as to specifically how many, but hundreds and hundreds of years. And I've always found that to be a fascinating thing. So I'm just mentioning as off the top here that I'm talking to you from Treaty 7.
Thank you. And thanks for sharing the stories, because I think I want to get better at that as well. I think that is the whole point, right?
Well, the stories are what sticks with you, right? The names and the dates, they become fuzzy over time, but the ideas stick with you.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not just about acknowledging it, it's about acknowledging something that has happened and what we can learn from. And that's what I think when you mention the indigenization of education too, right? That's the whole point of that, to try to really reconcile the histories.
Well, it's going to be more and more important as we have more and more, the environment is becoming more and more pertinent, and we can't avoid the reality of a changing environment much longer. And the Indigenous worldview is going to become more and more relevant. And how you have, you talk about, you have a freedom, we have freedom rallies, but with freedom comes responsibility. And that's the Indigenous view. What's your responsibility to the land and to the people around you, and taking care of your own, and not just what are you allowed to do, but what do you have to do in return?
Key principles in sport too, right? I think is another reason why I'm so devoted to sport. I just think it embodies so many of these concepts if you really take the time to distill them and help kids learn. You talk a bit about that in your book too, about how important it is to be in the moment while you're involved in sport, to be learning these things and grappling with them and making sense of them. Love it.
Yeah, well, you introduced me as the wise Duff Gibson, and I thought, oh, that's a tough one to live up to. So I will say right off the bat that if I have wisdom, my wisdom came after the fact. In hindsight, I'm super smart in hindsight. And so one of the things that I talk about in the book is, I wish I had appreciated what a beautiful moment in my life that was in the moment, as opposed to being, that's part of the drive, right? You're dreaming of being this much better and this much better, and what it could be like, and you need that to be successful. What is, if you've never thought of what it could be to be successful, or being in a position with one heat to go in the lead, that's something that you need to be mentally prepared for. So I'm not diminishing, you have to learn from your history and you have to dream of the future, but being in the present moment is the only way we are capable of experiencing the world, to quote Eckhart Tolle, right?
Tell us about that moment, being in the lead, one heat to go.
Well, I think, I look back on my career, and the more I think about it, the more grateful I am to have had the teammates and the staff and the team leadership that I had. We were all not kids. We all had jobs. I was in my 30s. Both of my Olympic teammates in Torino were in our 30s at that time. So let's see, did Paul, one of my teammates, I don't think had kids yet, but we had experienced a lot of life, and we had a sense that life would go on. I think that's probably the single greatest gift that my father gave me, was that sport is so awesome and I love it, and we talk about it constantly, and really it doesn't matter. And I had that sense because it never interfered with my schooling. It never, if I had to choose between meeting my wife and going down that family path in sport, it wouldn't have taken a moment to make that decision. You know what I mean? Like the most important things in life. I have an experience of winning an Olympic gold medal that proved to me that it doesn't really matter.
Right.
And it's you have that. I talk in the book about a woman who got fourth at the Olympics in the 100 meters, the most competitive event. and how it, she obsessed over it for years and years. And then her father died, and she realized it really made no difference in the big picture, and yet it was occupying so much of her time. And I had the same experience from the other perspective. And I don't want to belittle that or make it sound like I'm saying that was no big deal. But it really did not change my life in any, I got a few speaking opportunities. Someone would look at my book because I was an Olympic gold medalist. I don't want to look a gift horse in the mouth for the benefits it has afforded me. But I often say that I have a certain credibility in a conversation, whether I know nothing about that conversation or not, because I have, because the planets aligned, and truly that's a big part of it, from genetics and the track we were on and the moment in history, the planets aligned, and I have this Olympic gold medal, and now I have a credibility to at least start a conversation, and whether that's deserved or not. And there are others like Jason Dorland, who I know is a mutual friend of ours, who has an incredibly powerful message, to the point where I bought every one of the athletes that I was coaching a copy of his book, because it was such a beautiful arriving at that same place eventually, doing it the wrong way and going, that was a huge mistake, and realizing the price that he paid over time, and thinking there is a much better way of doing this. And in his words, the way his wife Robin did it was bulletproof. Win or lose, it's always about you challenging you. And the longer that I'm retired, one of the thought-provoking questions that you sent me is, what have you learned from sport lately? Well, as my competitive days are long over, they're not over. I'm still, and have always only competed against myself. And now it's just in paddleboarding or something where I'm trying to slow my descent into old manhood. It's still a challenge. It's still the greatest joy and why I'm still involved with sport.
Beautiful. Yeah, and I've said that to kids I coach, where you'll probably, because they want to win, and I'm like, you'll probably win when you don't need to. It's that beautiful sort of paradox of letting it go, and then it'll happen. Because it can't consume your focus. It has to be about what you say, challenging yourself, or some process goal, or these beautiful things. Yeah, and I want to keep pushing on that, because I make fun of going backwards in a boat and kind of minimizing, it doesn't matter. But at the same time, there's something about going backwards in a boat that is akin to perfecting the violin. Like, there's something common to all of these endeavors.
Yes.
Yeah. What is it? What is it for you?
What is it? What's the answer? Step back. I'll just give you the answer to the meaning of life here.
Yeah.
I think sometimes when I'm introduced, someone says he did wrestling in high school, then rowing in university, and then it was speed skating and bobsledding, and then at age 39 he was an Olympic champion. What great perseverance. And it has nothing to do with perseverance, because perseverance implies a struggle. And if I was doing what I love to do, if anything, I was avoiding my real life, the real world after that. It's not perseverance if you loved every minute of it. And that is such a key aspect to it. I can think of an example of, I have to be careful not to be too specific about it, but I went on a track walk. I can't remember if I was coming to the end of my head coaching career, but when the Sochi Olympics were over, I haven't been involved with high performance skeleton or any sport from that moment on. And I don't remember if I was the head coach or I had retired, or it was near when I was retiring. And I was in Whistler. It was one of the last times I was in Whistler, and some of the new athletes were there. And I said, I'm here to coach, I'm here to help. And my default has always been, if you knock on my door at any hour of the night because you have to learn more and you're so interested and you are just racking your brain, that's the only reason I'm there. And so I said to someone that I wasn't coaching, or a group, I said, I'll walk the track tomorrow with anyone who wants to. If you want to do it every day this week, if you want to talk about it after the fact, I'm there. And they said, yeah. Track walk the next morning. And I'm somewhat long-winded, I guess, maybe some would say. My way of thinking about a corner might be more specific or elaborate as compared to some people, but the track walk for me, you start at the bottom, you end at the top, and then it's 15 minutes or half an hour until it's time for you to have your practice. And it took 2 hours. It was a good, thorough track walk. And the next day, none of them wanted to do it again because it took 2 hours. And that is my experience as a coach, is that you can't force someone to be obsessed with something the way I was. Again, I mentioned how lucky I was to be on the team in that moment in time, and we were obsessed. And I mentioned just one example of it in the book where we drove all day to get to Eagles, Austria, and we hadn't had dinner, and we tried to drive to the track because the official training started the next morning, and it was locked up. So we walked in running shoes through a snow-covered farmer's field and hopped a fence to get into the track to walk it before, after it was locked up for the evening, but before they had shut the lights off, because we were obsessed with getting better. And it's, I say to a skeleton or a bobsleigh or a luge athlete or a skier. Downhill skiing is the one that I draw a parallel with because it's much more relatable to people. In these sports, a little mistake takes you right out of the running. And there isn't anyone who wouldn't acknowledge that because everybody has lived that. And for the first 3 years of your World Cup career, you go, oh, that one mistake cost me 3/10 and I would have been 9th instead of 16th or what have you. But it works two ways. And if you obsess about the track and you learn it cold, people say, oh, you're going so fast, you must have great reflexes. It has nothing to do with reflexes. It has to do with timing and reacting. If something doesn't go perfectly and you hit a wall and suddenly you're going this way instead of this way, it's an immediate reaction. You need to know that cold. It's like a pitcher, it's like a batter in baseball. This is a fastball. This is a curveball. And there's no time to go, I think that was a curveball, so I should probably, it's too late. You need to react. And skeleton is very much the same way. And so there's a payoff for thinking about it and thinking about it and thinking about it. And it helps not to have kids. You know what I mean? It helps to be very, very singularly focused. And I, as a coach, I look at the Beijing Olympics and I think there was a Chinese athlete in the men's skeleton who won a bronze medal, who 4 years ago, I don't know how accurate, if this is exactly accurate, but last year I was unaware of that person. So the track was so complicated and the world had maybe 50 tries before an Olympics, and that guy I'm sure had hundreds of tries. That made the difference. This is a sport where an obsession, being a pitcher in baseball, or a pitcher also, but a batter in baseball is almost entirely a mental thing. With Kaylee Humphries, I don't know if you know that name, won the monobob, and I don't know what her ranking is athletically, but it was all about the drive. You have a Chinese man who won a bronze, I think it was a bronze, in the men's skeleton, who was not to be heard of 4 years prior. It's all about the drive and understanding. And yet, there are people, and there will always be people, who don't want to do a track walk because it took too long, and I'm trying to get limbered up so I have my best athletic practice, when that's not less important. The best will always be great at every aspect.
Sure.
But you can't sacrifice one for the other. And that's a personal thing. I mean, that's where to tie it back to, it's an obsession. And I know Cal Botterill doesn't like the term, it should be a possession. Are you pulled or pushed, and he's very specific about that. Are you drawn to it because you love it, or are you forced into it and you feel like you have to? That's a very important distinction. But people typically don't break it down that much and use the term obsession. And I, as a coach two different types of athlete. One that you needed to say, you could do a little more there. Let's do another track walk. Let's think about that. Let's break that down. And one where you recommend a book to because they will drive themselves crazy if they think about it 24 hours a day, and they need to sleep, and they need to, here's a book, read this book, or watch. My youngest sister, in my second last year as an athlete, sent me, or gave me for Christmas one year, season 2 of Scrubs, a TV show called Scrubs. And it's just the goofiest, stupid slapstick comedy show. I'd never heard of Scrubs, let alone watched season 1, but I can tell you in hindsight that season 2 is the best season. But she and I have similar senses of humor, and she said, you'll love this. And it was fantastic. It was a beautiful distraction from thinking about how to go, something I hear in rowing all the time is, does it make the boat go faster? And that's all we thought about as a team collectively, and me individually, all the time. How do we get down that track a tiny bit faster? And the results spoke for themselves.
Well, they sure did. And I want to hear more about this idea of obsession, because I think I totally relate, but it came to me gradually. So I think I also relate to those athletes that said, hey, no, that was a couple hours, like I'll never get back or whatever. They're not as motivated. But I had to kind of learn almost. I think I always loved sport, and I was always kind of driven. But what you describe is unique, and it came to our crew a little bit later. The willingness to, and the eagerness to land, and even though you're jet lagged, to make that effort. I want to get to that course. I need to see the course. We all need to talk about it, blah, blah, and very, very possessed and obsessed by it. But I don't remember being that as a younger athlete. As a crew, we were just like, woo, we're in Amsterdam or whatever. It wasn't quite the same focus, right? And so how do you think that is born? Do you think it is something that these kids learn, that they, and if so, what do you think contributes to it? Like, I'm trying to reflect on, well, what sparked that for us? What made us more and more and more singularly focused or willing to do the track walk? That's actually a great phrase. I will steal. Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. I've always said that you can't make a kid, because I think of it now in terms of youth sport. And I believe emphatically that you fix youth sport, and the success of an Olympic team in every sport will explode if you fix youth sport, but instead of driving kids out of it. But to your point, I don't think you can make someone love something, but you can take the fun out of it, right? So let's start with not taking the fun out of it and understanding what motivates a kid. And I've heard someone say that the youth sports system is designed for the 1%. And that's not even true. It's designed for a 1% segment who didn't quit. By the time they're deciding who's elite or who's going to go on to a college program or whatever it is. But if you're fantastic at age 10, you're more likely to do it all year round. You're more likely to have a crazy coach who wants you to get up early and do 1,000 shots in the garage or whatever it is. You're more likely to have the fun driven out of it for you. So it's not the top 1%. It's a 1% segment when a bunch of people quit, including people who potentially had tremendous potential. So that's just a specific point I wanted to make, but it's, it does have to do with culture. And you have, on the one hand, I say jet lag. And I've always said jet lag is an inconvenience. Jet lag is something that makes me want to fall asleep at an odd time that will perpetuate itself tomorrow. So we all had the same belief about jet lag. Jet lag, if you're jet lagged, you should go to the venue. You should do a track walk, because what are you going to do otherwise? Fall asleep and make it worse for tomorrow. Jet lag is a pain in the neck. It's not something that's physically debilitating. That's always been my attitude about it. And part of that has to do with the culture. And for me, I had a great team leader. There were times when we didn't have a technical coach, and I had 3 teammates who were all technically brilliant. And so we had the same expectations for each other. And we, 2 out of the 3 of us had, or 2 out of the 4 of us, when we were, the World Cup was a 4-person men's team and women's team. The Olympic team was a 3-person. So we traveled as a 4-person team, and we all were married, and 2 of us had kids. So we weren't there to piss around and waste our times. I talked about that in the book. That was a huge motivator for me. I'm not here to, I sound like things an asshole says. I'm not here to make friends. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not here to have a visit. And we all thought of it as in exactly the same way. So we hopped the fence as grown men to sneak into a venue, and we spent, independent of the team, independent of the coach, we spent hours where we would go around the room. I used to make our team do this when I became a coach. We'd go around the room. What's your thought about corner 1? Did it work for you? And that it was, I had one teammate who was a world medalist, a World Cup medalist at least, before I joined the team. And so his attitude was, I'm not going to be a part of that. I'm not going to help you to get better. And so the rest of us, we did that. And our growth trajectory was huge. And eventually he's, when we started to beat him semi-regularly, he said, I was wrong. You were right. Can we do this differently? And then we were, I look back, I have Greg Uchez, Dr. Greg Uchez is a friend of mine, and our kids played hockey together, and he was the therapist. He's a sports chiropractor, and he has a clinic in town, and every once in a while, myself or my wife or a kid will go, and so we'll catch up. And he had a little podcast recently, and it's wonderful to see his recollection of it through it's wonderful for me to enjoy that experience through someone else's eyes. And I imagine, like, my father passed before I went to the Olympics, but I think of, my dad experiencing my world championship win by watching numbers come up on a computer screen. And that's a joyful thing for me to experience through his eyes. And Greg was talking about how we were sitting 1st, 2nd, and 4th after the first heat, and that's how it ended. And how we were joking around like we didn't have a care in the world, which is an absolute credit to my teammates and staff, that they had terrible, stupid, goofy senses of humor that kept everything light. And visualization allowed you to direct any kind of nervous energy to where it should go as well. That was a huge part of it. And how, his perspective was, he had a conversation with the media attaché and the chef about what if we finish 1, 2, 3, and how that had never happened before. And, and we were this close to making it happen. And, I talk about in the book about how my teammate went, came out of the groove, went over a piece of ice and went boom into the wall. And that cost him the difference from 4th to 3rd, and what a shame that was, and how that's my one negative regret of it. But to see that from other people's perspectives. But I think I started, I've gone on 2 different tangents here.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It's all good.
But I think we started to talk about culture, and it's, the Spartans had a culture as well, and it was super successful, and it's not good. If you had, I'm sure it wins. You know what that makes me think of is a Kath Bishop, who's, if people are looking, I know you've had her on this webinar, and I think her book, The Long Wind. What a terrible,
Speaking of which,
what a terrible, what a terrible Freudian slip. Um, but that might be one of the best I've ever read about an athlete's experience translating it to the real world. And I wondered if, because her coach, she had an Olympic experience and it was off the podium, and it was a dog eat dog, and you go to beat the shit out of your teammate and your own body every single practice for years. And that was the mentality. And then, correct me if I'm wrong, but that coach left and became the Canadian coach. Am I right about that? You're okay. I'm looking at your face. Is it? Okay.
He got tempered a little bit for a while.
Well, I wondered if that was the case, because she's not specific about it, and I know you would know the people involved. But to me, that is a beautiful example of someone who didn't fit of one person's impression of what the mold should be. And cultures like that, where it's, and my understanding was that he was a very kind and wonderful man who was at moments in time, at least, was an absolute slave driver, and every practice was kill or be killed. And it clearly didn't work for her, and she became a better version of herself in a different environment.
Well, and interestingly, he did get tempered because he was forced, when he came to Canada, into a more of a culture like you described, where competition was collaborative and we're all getting stronger together. And so he's forced to work with the women's coach as well, and a little trio. It was quite beautiful. It lasted quite a while. And then I think it started to, degrade again back to the more Spartan culture. I love that. Yeah. And I think,
so the Spartan, what I was going to say was that the Spartan culture works for a period of time.
Yeah.
And you can, if you take a group and you beat the crap out of them, some will rise to a very high level in that environment before, but most will not. And it's not sustainable. And I think of the, speed skating back in the day in the Netherlands, or track in the United States, where you have so many medals in track in the United States. But if you want to represent the United States, you have to beat everyone else from the United States at the trials, which is a month or two ahead of the Olympics. So by design, by the very design of that system, their athletes won't be at their best when it matters most. And other countries don't do it that way. And you don't get the best out of your best people in that way. And it's also, when someone says, oh, that's a great coach, I always feel like saying, that's a great coach for a specific individual.
Yeah. And
that's probably a terrible coach for someone on that same team. And Jason Dorland, to use him again, was, he would talk about Keith, the coach. I can't remember the name of the Netflix show where it followed the Leafs. Mm. And he talked about the swearing. He talked about the bottom line is that you want to create a coach who's pretty good for almost everybody, or allows room for everybody to be the best version of themselves. But that swearing, F you every second word, that's going to be a fantastic coach for a few people and a terrible coach for a few people, and somewhere in the middle for everybody else. And that's true of every coach and every athlete. And that's why I think, I don't know if you wanted to direct this at some point. I know we'll get into systemic change and what do we need to do differently, but there are obvious ramifications along those lines.
Yeah, because that's exactly what we're wrestling with right now, right? And it's often the debate point is, well, it works for some people. And I would argue personally, I don't think it works for anybody. I think, you'll get some wins, but at what cost? You're damaging people, even when I'm that kind of person where I've survived some traumatic, abusive situations because I'm a survivor, but I don't count that as a success. I realize that there's damage through that, and probably we all used to laugh on our team, even that many of us came from dysfunctional families. There was one woman that didn't, and we'd make fun of her, as a crazy black humor, but it made us survivors. Is that a healthy thing? No. So how do we help the system, the sports system, evolve to a point where we reach what we talk about theoretically, that we can be stronger even if we're kind to one another and adaptable and foster belonging and embrace diversity. What would it take? You talked a bit about fixing youth sport, until we fix youth sport. So let's go there. What would it take to fix youth sport? And maybe then it would scale up to, these principles would scale up to high performance sport. What do you think? How do you fix youth sport?
Well, you begin by understanding what motivates a young person. And my experience is that, and I used to row, by the way, at Western for the 4 years that I was there. And did you know that my uncle was Ted Gibson? Who
Yes,
was
right.
an Olympian in '84, which is why I got into rowing. And I'll just begin with a brief story. We had a coach once who we were doing, I don't know what the efforts were, but we were in the middle of I don't know, 5 times a 1,000 effort or whatever it was. And he starts yelling at us and belittling us for not giving it a full effort. And that was my reaction to it was, if he said that to my face outside of the boat, I would need to be restrained, and he could go F himself, because I will never be, I'm not a professional athlete in that sense, but I'm very professional about how I go about it. And no one can motivate me externally more than I'm capable of motivating myself. And that's my experience with speed skaters and rowers, and any of this Calgary is this beautiful Olympic hub, and we're all in the same place and the same facilities at the same time. And I see people who are they come across as, like I said before, perseverance, mental toughness. No, they're doing what they are obsessed with, what they love to do. And I was like that since I was just small. Just get out of the way of that. That's a big part of that. Don't mess that up. I can remember, I was thinking about this today in preparation for our talk. When I was in grade 9, and when I went to high school in Ontario, decades ago, high school was 9 to 13. Yeah. So I was about to go into grade 9, and I played age group football, and I wanted to try out for the school team, but I was so undersized. I also did wrestling, and I wrestled 97 pounds when I was in grade 9. Yeah. And I can remember being on a Christmas holiday at my grandmother's and going to a toboggan hill. Like, this sounds so crazy coming out of my mouth to say it, but in grade 9, spring break or Christmas break, running off the top of a toboggan hill and diving and landing on the hill down to smash my body, because I figured I needed to toughen myself up to be a football player, as someone who wrestled in the 97-pound cat. If that's not, that is the opposite of someone who needs to be motivated. That's the opposite of someone who needs to be yelled at to practice. My brother-in-law, I remember my wife's kid brother said, when he was in grade 8, he was one of the first kids in grade 9 to make the grade 12 baseball team or something along those lines. And he and his buddy, when it rained, they would go out into the field and they would practice throwing balls over each other's heads. So they would turn and sprint and dive. And they did it when it was rain because you wouldn't, tear your knees as much. Right. You know what I mean? Like, can you imagine? Like, that is nuts. I love how beautiful that is, that someone would choose that as an activity because they dreamed of being a part of that and being the best baseball player and being on the winning team or whatever it was. That's sport from joy. That's an intrinsic, whatever inspires an intrinsic love of the game. And as I said before, I don't know that you can make someone love it, but you can take the fun out of it. So, and I've had this, I don't know if you know Dr. Steve Norris, but I've had this conversation with him. And I said to him once, I watched my kid play hockey before, and I'm certain that he would become a better hockey player if he skipped practice and played outdoor for an hour. And he said that is the, and he's, he is a brilliant, master of all trades, if there is such a thing, research doctor, associated with the National Sports Center in Calgary when I was an athlete and as a coach. And he's like, and has been contracted by Hockey Canada and Hockey USA. And it's like, yes, that is exactly the case. If you're standing in a lineup versus skating around the puck, being tired, controlling the puck, turning back and whatever, because there's only 8 people on the ice at the time.
Yeah.
You are developing faster than whatever you might be doing in a practice, especially if you're 10 years old.
Oh, God.
And you look at, you look at, I remember when my youngest son is 15, and when he was 8, he tried, I don't remember if that's Adam or whatever that is. I remember him saying, that kid over there, he's going to the NHL. And I thought, the parents of that kid, people think like that kid was so much better than anyone else around them. And now that we're 15, he's still really, really good. But people have caught up. And I don't know, check back in 5 years from now, and who knows? He might just be absolutely sick of it by that point, because it's been a job for that kid for a long time. And I know his parents have moved him a couple of times to do that.
Instead of letting it emerge and others catch up, but then if he still has the joy and carries on, and instead we discover them at 8 and then put pressure and that takes the fun out of it for sure. It's a whole new mindset, right? We've attached. It's interesting when you said winning a gold medal. I got a couple of speaking engagements, or I have some credibility in the beginning of a conversation, and I've often thought that too. Like, it really doesn't. I don't know why we care about a medal table as a country. Like, it's so irrelevant. And what does it really get us other than it's a little marker of achievement, but keep going, keep going. And I feel like suddenly we've placed this value on it at 8 years old, that they're supposed to go to the Olympics, or it's really messed things up. Yeah. I love also when you said, these kids diving in the rain and you throw yourself down on a toboggan, which is brilliant.
No toboggan.
But you're like, that's nuts. But it's so beautiful. And I agree. I think it's so beautifully nuts. But I know I've often been judged. I was that kid too. And I would, be out even in my 30s. I'd go do hill repeats or whatever. And I remember this buddy of mine going like, what is your problem? And I thought, you get that a lot though, like you absolutely are nuts. And I think, how is it nuts to be striving for excellence? Like, I don't get that. But have you ever encountered that sort of that there's something mentally unstable about you because you want to be obsessed about going faster?
Yeah, I don't remember any. I mean, I did that diving off the hill by myself, and if other kids showed up with a toboggan, I probably would have left or something. But yeah, I don't know. It's just what I always thought was fun. And so the question becomes, what is it about the system now that can scrape that out of the way? And we get, and I'm the same. A big push comes from the parents who think, oh, my 8-year-old is destined for the NHL. I remember there's a video I once shared on social media, and I don't remember his name, but he was the high performance director he was an employee of High Performance Sport New Zealand. And he said he goes for talent recruitment seminars all the time, and people say, what's a high performance in a 12-year-old? What would you consider high performance? And his answer is flat out, no such thing. There's no such thing as a high performance 12-year-old. There's only someone who's better than other 12-year-olds. And why are you better than other 12-year-olds? Well, you might have had a growth spurt first. I can tell you for hockey for 8-year-olds, the best 8-year-old is the kid who started skating earlier and did it more. Mm-hmm. And if you're competing against kids who are learning to skate and you can already stick handle through pylons, you're going to get a a misdiagnosis of your future potential.
Yeah.
And there's so many examples of, I can think of an NHL player who said, yeah, I was pretty average, pretty average, pretty average, pretty average. But we remember the Connor McDavids, or who, the Tiger Woods, who was the champ at age 4. There are, I would say, Christina Groves, 4 Olympic medals in speed skating. I wasn't that good. I was not good when I was younger. Becky Scott would tell you the same thing. Not that good. Not that good. And I think that if you analyzed her muscle fiber type, or where you could, I'm of the belief that only a certain body type could do that. And if she didn't have that body type, then maybe it would have translated in the sprint, or maybe she never would have been. You know what I mean? Like, you can't avoid, I always say you can't avoid the physics of it.
Yeah.
If you want to get a rebound from Shaq, you're up against physics, and it doesn't matter how much you believe and obsess. There is a genetic component, and that's, rowing. There's a body type for rowing. There's a body type for almost anything that you can think of. And if you are suited for some things, by definition, you're not suited for others. And it reminds me, what you just said about credibility in a certain conversation. Well, I was good as a high school wrestler, but a mile away from the monster that I would have had to have beaten to represent Canada. And as a rower, I was good, but there was, remember back, there was the Dr. Jessinger.
Yeah.
Before, Concept 2 was invented, but it was like the hockey cards and the wheels sort of thing. And my erg score was good enough to make the national team, but there was no lightweight at the Olympics, so I moved on.
Right.
And then it was speed skating, and then it was bobsleigh, and then skeleton. And I have a very strong sense of, if I stopped before I found skeleton, I would not have that credibility in a conversation, and I would be the same person.
Yeah.
And the reason I was successful, I say bobsleigh would have been the same thing, but you have to wait your turn almost, and you have to mortgage your house to have equipment that's competitive. So I just went to skeleton, and then I was successful internationally, because what I am suited for is what that sport demanded, and what I'm not suited for isn't involved. And that's different from a little bit different from everything else that I had done previously. And so I look at someone who finishes 9th at an Olympics, or a Jason Dorland who finishes 6th at the Olympics, and I don't look at that and go, pretty good. I look at what went into that, and it's crazy what went into that. And I don't judge someone for something that could have been physically outside of his body's structure, the way he was born. Because I don't know if you saw a few weeks ago, he saw someone do a presentation, and they talked about be prepared to work hard and positive attitude and these sort of things. And his point was, probably every single individual sitting in a boat on that finish line, on that starting line at that Olympic final when he went, would check off each one of those boxes. So what's the difference? Well, you cannot avoid the reality that genetics plays a part in that. And I have a strong sense of that, because if I quit sport after speed skating, I would have been good at a lot of things, but never Team Canada, never an Olympic medal. And I'm the same person. So I have a very strong awareness of that, and how that translates to tie that. I'm really presenting myself as a long-winded person here, but I will tie that back to youth sport. Mm-hmm. And how that ties back to is, in our program, we structure Dark Horse Athletic. We structure it so that the thought that I'm doing basketball with someone who's done it since they were 5 and is way better than me never crosses their mind. Because the thought that someone at age 9, before going through puberty, would not want to play basketball because the person near them was better than them is tragic. That's tragic. And so we set things up differently to allow a kid like me when I was in grade 9, or my brother-in-law when he was a kid, to just get into something and love it and spend every day, as Steve Nash does on this Sportsnet commercial that I've seen shown because we're into the NBA playoffs. If you find something you love to do it every day. I love that. Now, if that's not something unhealthy, if that's a sport, if that's a musical instrument, if that's not something that interferes with your physical or mental well-being, then that's a beautiful thing. I say that to my kids. My hope for you is that you find something that you absolutely love to do and can fully sink your teeth into. And I don't care, I'm somewhat sport obsessed, but if it's not sport, it's your life.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I love that. Just, let them play. They're going to problem solve. They're going to, and kids will adjust. Like if they're going to win by too much or whatever, if they're going to dominate, they'll sort of add a new rule or constrain themselves. So like we know kids will do that very naturally. Yeah, I love it.
I mentioned that in the book. Do you remember that? It was just a sentence or two when
Yep.
there was one moment, like I thought it was very significant that we'd play hours and hours and hours of road hockey and never keep score until someone with a net had to go, in which case it meant that, it was dark. It was pitch black. My eyes worked so much better back then, but it was the game was going to end, and then we said next goal wins. And that's the only time it ever crossed our minds who the winner would be. And and it at the same time, every goal was overtime in the Stanley Cup Finals.
Yeah.
In our minds, because that's part of the fun. And the one caveat to that was an occasion I remember, and I don't know how often this happened. It may have only happened one time, but I remember being on my friend's driveway, and we only had a few kids, maybe 5 kids, and not enough to go 5-on-5, and one net and one goalie. So we played sort of a king of the hill kind of a thing, where 2-on-2 in someone's driveway. It's not on a street. You don't have quite the same space. So it's 2-on-2. You have a game to 3 or 5. And the loser subs out and another team comes in. And then you have another game. And the loser subs out and another team comes in.
Yeah.
And if someone won that game 3-0 or 5-0, exactly what you just said, we had a sense of what was fair and what elevated the game, what was a better experience. If someone won 5-0, we changed the teams.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't as fun. It wasn't as challenging. How did we, no one pushed us in that direction. And we had a sense of that being a better experience, that it would be close and a real battle.
Yeah.
And I remember saying, I can remember being on the team that won at one point and say, well, let's just switch up the teams so it's more even. And the other team arguing that they didn't want to switch it up because they didn't need the help and they wanted to do it again. They just wanted, it was like, we'll show you. And that, no one taught us that. That is just the beauty of letting kids play and figure it out themselves. And I think back to, you'd run full blast for 2 hours. Something I would be physically incapable of doing as an adult. As an Olympian, I would be physically incapable of what we did, max effort, back then, because that was fun.
Right. Yeah, it's not clouded. Like earlier you said, it would never cross these kids' minds to not want to play with a kid who'd skated longer or was better or was bigger. And same, I remember playing with the boys, that you would never think, well, there's no point playing because they're going to be faster or stronger. You just played and you did your best and it worked out and you adjusted the rules. Beautiful. And fun equals challenge. Fun equals fair, but fair because it's more challenging. It's all kind of intertwined. It's beautiful.
It's all the intrinsic motivations of what motivates a human. And Jason, again, I think that's the 3rd time I've mentioned him. He talks about the different levels of motivation. And is it for a medal? Is it for your teammates? That's much more powerful. If you have a sense of something that's beyond yourself, that's a much more powerful thing. And for kids, it's so simple. Do you love to do Glenn Mulcahy? says don't be, ends all his videos with "Don't be a kid's last coach." And what does that say? Make it fun. Make them want to come back. That's such a simple prescription, a simple way of breaking it down. And I wish we could evaluate. It's not, feasible to evaluate sports programs on 40 years later how many of your kids are still doing it, still enjoy it. But that should be the bottom line. And so the next best thing is next year, how many of your kids still doing it? How many of them, I look at the kids. I've reconnected with some of the kids that I was on the same block with, and through Facebook, and they're coaching their kids now because their experience of sport, and hockey in particular in this case, is that it's a beautiful and wonderful thing. And I feel optimistic about their kids' future potential and enjoyment of the sport. And I believe very, very strongly that if that's your goal, if your goal is to have kids still loving it and dreaming about it 20 years from now, then high performance sport will take care of itself.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've spent so much time thinking about this, of course, too, and this idea of what's at the center. And I hear a lot about athlete centered, and I struggle with it because as an educator, we talk more about learning centered. It's dangerous to put the student at the center because we're all learning. Teachers are learning, professors are learning. That's what research is for, is the learning of the world. Like everybody's learning. And I think sport could benefit from that too, that idea of a sport experience or sport at the center. It's no one individual, because that way it is about that. It's about the love. And if you're fostering a beautiful sport experience, no matter where someone is in that sport experience or what role they're playing, because some people actually don't love sport, but if it can still benefit those people, good. To me, that's a huge measure. It shouldn't cause them to hate it. They may not have an interest in it, but you sure don't want them to think it's a terrible thing. So how do we create sport? So how do we fix youth sport now? Because it has changed. We sound like a couple old grandpas talking about the good old days on the street when the lights and the mom's yelling dinner and you have to finally run in. And my kids look at me with just tears in their eyes half the time because they think you had such a great childhood and so much autonomy. So we can't go back, but what do we do now? Because youth sport is the way it is right now, and there is pressure, and we are identifying kids too young. What do we need to do you think? What would you recommend if you could?
Yeah. Well, it's did you watch Matt Young's last TED Talk that just came out? I know we know all the same
Yeah, it's funny
people, and some of them are on the West Coast, so I'm assuming you might know them.
Yes.
Like not through a computer screen like I know them, but a lot of his stuff is of that TED Talk in particular is exactly what I've been saying as well. But he made a point that I thought, yeah, that's so true. It's how many billions of dollars go into youth sport in North America, and there's no overseeing body, and that's a very good point. And I've had conversations with the Calgary Sport Council about this, or individual members, and say, look, you make it about winning, it takes the inherent fun out of it, and that's failing to recognize what motivates a young person and makes them want to participate. And by the way, I don't care what level, they all win and lose, in hockey or a team sport like soccer. 50% on any given day, 50% of the teams will win and 50% will lose. It's how you see beyond that.
Yeah.
How when you get into Carol Dweck's stuff about a growth mindset, and that's really about how do you look at failure. It's winning is always going to be more fun than losing, but not participating and sitting on the bench because you need the best players to go out there, that's way less fun than losing. So that's and to my point about the Calgary Sport Council, they're focused on safe sport right now. And so be it. Like, how do you argue with that? If someone is actually in an abusive environment, that's your first priority. But how do you, I tend to think of it in, the books that I read used to be about sport and about people, and now it's about psychology, because it's about how do we think. And if you look at it from the example I use in the Tao of Sport is one moment where they tried to pick off in Little League. A back catcher tried to pick off a kid leading off first, and the ball goes into right field. And the coach says, and if you're a parent of a Little League kid, you've heard this 100 times, just focus on the batter. In other words, don't do that. We're trying to win here. That's the only justification for it. Why would you tell a kids, and Little League is house league. It's every kid plays. So it's regular season, kids, house league. Everyone makes the playoffs anyway. The whole reason you're there is to make kids enjoy it.
Yeah.
And what do? You tell a kid not to do that.
Be creative.
You should do that constantly, in practice at least. And I would have I thought to myself, even if a kid's going to make it to first, throw to first anyway, because you need to go through the reps of doing that.
Yeah.
I had I have so many stories here. I remember when my youngest was machine pitch, which is before a kid even can pitch.
Yeah.
It's just a machine that lobs it over. And he had a coach that told the team, don't even throw it to first. We'll wait for 3 outs because they go to second and third if you throw to first, because it always goes past the first baseman. Can you imagine such a thing? In hindsight, that's crazy. When you look at it, I think you wrote an article a couple of days ago, and I shared it because it hits the nail on the head, which is, what is the purpose? Why are we doing this? And I talked about it a little bit. What's the purpose of youth sport? It's not a track to the NHL or the PGA or the Olympic Games. It's to make every kid lead a healthier life. It's for mental health as well as it's for lifelong mental and physical well-being. That's why it exists. Therefore, if you're doing anything that conflicts with that makes someone not want to do it, that takes the fun out of it by making it too much about who's the champ, you're defeating the very reason it exists in the first place. And if you think about it in those terms, it becomes very simple, I think. Yeah. But I've also had people, resist that thought. But when you have a kid who tells you they don't want to play baseball anymore because they made the AAA Bantam top team for 2 years in a row, and that's my eldest son, and he's the parent who takes it too seriously, which is hidden inside me that I try to fight, is proud, like my wife is proud that he made this top competitive baseball team, but they practiced 4 out of the 5 weeknights, and then played a doubleheader Saturday and a doubleheader Sunday for months and months, and he did that for 2 years and now doesn't want anything to do with it. Mm-hmm. So, and they're kids. That's my point. They're 13. That's Bantam. I know it's AAA, but that's kids, and that's nonsense.
Good.
And yet it thrives, and there's huge. I should find the spot in David Epstein's range so I could quote it exactly, but his quote is something along the lines of, there's very few people promoting the idea of early specialization who don't profit from it.
Right.
Because there's undeniable research data about injuries and burnout and quitting it when you don't make the U16 or whatever it is. At that point when you quit, and never doing it again because you did it all year round, and leading a sedentary lifestyle because it was a job since you were 9.
Right.
Like that's insane. But how do I go to the corporation that runs the Spring Hockey League, the for-profit corporation that runs the off-season indoor soccer league. And I have to be careful that I'm not painting them all with the same brush.
Sure.
But they're set up like corporations, and they are, I should qualify that by saying Dark Horse is actually a corporation, because I didn't know, I had to, at some point as a business, I had to decide, am I a nonprofit or am I a corporation? And there's a hockey related nonprofit in town that's gone belly up, that was all about getting kids to play hockey and do extra hockey all year round. And someone took some money and disappeared. So that's, when I say corporation versus nonprofit, it doesn't really matter. Don't miss my point. My point is that profit is being generated. And so there's a very strong motivation and that ties back to human psychology. Someone will tell you and give you 30 very good reasons as to why your kid should be doing the off-season soccer program, even though your kid loves swimming or whatever it is. And they all make sense. And they all, and sometimes it's a threat, like they won't make the top team. I spoke to a coworker of mine last week who said it's actually a rule in their soccer program that you have to do this off-season team or you're not eligible for the top team come the spring, which is amazing to me, because I always thought that if you were good enough that they'd go, okay, we sort of have a rule, but okay, you come in anyway. So it didn't hurt everyone, but it's still a crap, a BS system. And I go back to Matt Young's position that there should be someone saying that that's BS and that shouldn't happen. And I think that, the Soccer Canada or Hockey Canada or whatever it is, in my opinion, should say, if you're going to do off-season stuff, it should be soccer. It should be, you want to have a nice time a week, this is what we recommend. And I think they do to a certain extent, but they stop short of saying, we don't, that's not helping hockey. And clearly, how Canada does in hockey internationally, if they lose to Finland, who has a population of 6 million people and fewer hockey rinks per capita than Canada does, and can field a better team, we should be looking at their system more than perpetuating the same thing that we're doing now. That's my if someone said, well, actually Hockey Canada is doing this, this, and this, I'm open to that conversation because I'm not chasing them down. Right?
Well, I remember challenging a VP from Hockey Canada at a conference to role model. What are you doing to role model, a different mindset, such as what you're describing? And the answer was, oh, no, we look to grassroots to do that. And I'm like, well, that's not role modeling really, but I agree. So role modeling would be great. However, the argument right now across the system is that the NSOs, the national sport organizations, need oversight, because right now they aren't role modeling in that way. They are succumbing to the winner takes all mentality, oversight. So oversight is great. Role modeling, excellent solution. And I love the systemic approach here. You also talked about measures, different measures. I think your mention of profit is really valuable insight as well. So there's, financial profit, but what are the social profits? So if we flip our focus to that positive vision of sport, what youth sport means, what it's for, what are some of the profits it can bring? Talk about health, mental health. What else does really supporting the joy, privileging joy within youth sport bring to the society?
Well, you're asking me what translates from youth sport to society. Mm-hmm. And I think, you must have read Angela Duckworth's Grit.
Yeah.
Right? And I've heard her on 3 or 4 podcasts before. I tried to buy the book at 2 or 3, I meant to read that years ago, and I've just gotten around to it. And it talks about Erickson's 10,000 hours, and it talks about Carol Dweck, and a lot of these same concepts. And I listen to that audiobook and I think to myself, she's really talking about not enduring something. She's talking about finding something that you love to do. That's a huge component of it. And I loved in that book also how she had a paragon of grit who said, yeah, I'm not gritty about everything. I do a crossword puzzle, and if I don't get it in 3 minutes, I look up the answer for that. And I love that because there are there are things that you should quit and move on from, right?
You just don't care that much. Yeah.
You don't care that much, and you shouldn't, and that's me for Sudoku. And
Yeah. You got me thinking about grit, like grit in your teeth. And I have grit about something I really love, like the sinking your teeth into something. It's a new way of thinking.
Yeah.
I don't like the enduring thing either. Same with resilience. We overuse that word. I think it's more thriving. You can't thrive. You can't grit your teeth on stuff unless you absolutely obsessively love it. So how do we preserve that through youth sport? And we know the benefits of it are, people being able to stick with things and come back. And we know it does so much for their mental health or physical health.
Yeah, I think it's encourage young people. I mean, you could talk about the barriers to it. And had this conversation the other day as well. There's the most beautiful spot a bobsleigh and skeleton track has ever been created is in Königssee, Germany, right near Berchtesgaden of World War II history, right in a mountain and lake. And a member of the German team that I competed against, his family's hotel was walking distance from that track, and the Canadian team stayed with this family. And through that, I learned that this athlete could literally walk over any daylight hour, any time, from 7 a.m. until it shut down at night, and take a run down the track. And if there was a luge competition going on at the time, he would have to wait, and then he could be a forerunner in between the heats. Like that's the worst case scenario of him just walking over whenever he wanted to do it. And you look at Canada Olympic Park, and I was part of a committee to help get there's a high school in town that has a multisport program that uses the facilities at COP. But if you stand at COP, you see ski jumps, and the big ones are out of date, fair enough, but you see a moguls run and a world class in 5 different sports right in front of you, and no one is there. No one's using it. What would it cost to just turn on the ski lift and invite schools to come over whenever they wanted to? Right. It's crazy to me. And other places do it differently. And for bobsleigh in particular, you can't do too many, there's repercussions, physical repercussions for doing it too much, and you need to have safety measures and so on. But the access for me is such
and the invitation and prioritizing that access, right? That decision that of course we would invite the kids to come at free and any time, because it's all about learning. It's education. It's part of, oh my God. So what's it going to take, Duff, in the last couple of minutes to switch people's minds into that kind of open-hearted mindset?
I don't know. I think in Calgary, we have something called All Sport One Day, where I can't give you a specific number, but there are over 100 sport organizations that it's a come in and try it for free day. Right. And I don't know why that's just not, Dark Horse, my family's multisport program, that's our open door policy. I'm not sure if my kid wants to do it. We'll have them come out, and we're batting 1,000 for the kids who come out and try it, right? And we try 9 different things, and kids have gone and tried basketball where it's not a game, where the person, if this is basketball to you, you need a little bit of skills, or basketball is going to be a really negative experience when someone comes up to you and, that's your experience with well, that shouldn't be your first experience with basketball. I think that I think we need federal or provincial or whatever oversight. And like Matt Young says, there needs to be someone saying this is good, this is not good, we should push it in this direction. And I think there is, the all sport one day should be all sport all days kind of a thing. It's a starting point, and I think probably a lot of individual uh, sport organizations have seen the value of that, because for that one day, I think they literally get a lot of kids to sign up to their programs. But it should be all sports, all days, and it should be. We need to have an appreciation for what motivates a young person, and I think it should go back. Like when I was a kid, when you were a kid, everything was through the schools, and there was such a value to that, because you played basketball for these months and then you couldn't play basketball anymore. You could do it yourself. You could do it in the playground. You could still practice. You could still get better. But there was no one who, it was, in theory, it was a teacher running it. And the teacher has taken an oath that they have a child's best interest at heart. And so you move on to the next thing and on to the next thing. And I always saw the advantage of that. And world-class rowers take up rowing in school. Yeah, late too, but it's a school thing. And same with basketball, and same with volleyball, and same with track. They did it in their school. They didn't need to do it when they were 6. They needed to run around and burn energy when they were 6. Yeah. So I think the kids might be the tough one, because it has there's a financial disincentive for all these organizations to change their mindset.
And insurance, like Robin says, although I love the school model too, for the reason that you can try things with your friend. So if you're a little bit, you've got a buddy or all your buddies, hey, let's go try this crazy thing. And that's how rowing was for me too. Like, I just want to try a new sport, and went with my buddy Roberta, and then off we went. Yeah. Love it. You've given us I just love chatting with you. This is fantastic. I saw a couple of questions poke up, but you were talking about it already, so I didn't feel like we needed to interrupt. There's a link, obviously, between some of the principles you mentioned about, the greatest measure is, are they staying with it? Are they still happy? Are they still loving it? And and this idea of oversight and pushing for a more open, invitational approach to sport, to give it a try, to revisit this concept of getting it back connected to education. Brilliant concepts.
Well, do you know what else I wanted to? Are we going to get cut off?
Am I going to be? People might leave, but you and I can stay for as long as.
Okay. Because one of the thought-provoking questions that you sent me was, how do you change the system? And we're talking about safe sport and toxic cultures and this sort of thing. And I randomly came across the Simon Sinek video yesterday. And it wasn't the first time I'd seen it, but I thought this is exactly ties into one of the problems that we have with the elite stream right now. And what he said, and you've probably heard him say this also, is we don't think of leadership in the right mentality. We think if you're really good at sales, we put you in charge of other salespeople, and you may have no inclination or capacity for leadership, but you're a good salesperson.
Yeah.
And that's, for the first time yesterday, that occurred to me that's what the sports system is, and myself included. I was hired because there are only so many people who can give you valid feedback about a skeleton run. You can't, you're not pulling from 1,000 people. You're not pulling from a dozen people. It would be less than that. And that's kind of out of necessity. And I would, maybe it's a much bigger pool for soccer. I'm sure it's a much bigger pool for different sports, but for ski jumping, I'm sure it's the same. You know what I mean? Like, there's many sports along those lines. And what, the point of the video was that leaders, we need to redefine leadership. Just like for youth sport, we need to redefine what the point is. We need to remember the purpose of youth sport. For leadership, we need to redefine what, a leader, in his words, a leader takes care of his people. It doesn't matter what you can do for sales. If you're in charge of sales people, you're in charge of them, taking care of them. And I look back, and I just had this realization for the first time yesterday, that and I mentioned this in the book, but what he's talking about is exactly the environment that I had. I had my best results as an athlete, second overall in the World Cup circuit, and won the World Championships in the year we didn't have a coach. We didn't have a technical coach. And part of that didn't matter because my teammates were better qualified than anyone we could hire. But what I needed was a leader, and what I had was a great leader. And her name, and I'm still in contact with her, and she grew up in the same town that my wife is from.
Mm-hmm.
There's all these connections, but she was someone who took care of us, and I knew cared about us. And I remember there was one moment when the World Cup circuit was over, the World Championships would start in Japan a week later. And I said, I know what's best for me. I need to get on a plane and go back to Canada for a week. Everyone else said, no, let's stay here and practice. We'll stay in the mountains and practice on a track that's irrelevant to the Japanese track anyway. And I remember her right after the last race driving me for 2 hours in the snow to get me to a flight in Innsbruck, or I can't remember where it was. And then herself driving back in the snow for 2 hours because she acknowledged that that would be my best mental state.
Right.
To get out of that environment and go back and be with my wife and sleep in my own bed and have my own training facilities and have a week off. And I had a fantastic World Championships. I had exactly what he was talking about in that video. A leader who she was a bobsledder. She didn't need to know anything about skeleton. We had the technical aspect taken care of. What I needed was someone I knew cared about me and demonstrated that. And so I think, and I was hired to be the head coach, and this is a position of prestige, and we throw that title around, and paychecks are based for the head coach. Yep. And I think what we need a technical coach, and we need a team leader, a team captain, or whatever you want to call it. And that becomes the most important person. And structurally, that would be easier to change, I think.
Absolutely. It's funny, and we teach so much leader. I mean, we have this flagship program at Royal Roads that it was born upon really is leadership. And I find sport people, I teach across the system, leadership programming in different ways and shapes, like with the CFL players, but they're the most quick to acknowledge that they lack leadership skills. And yet, and I love that. No CEO has ever said that to me. They would never say, they don't stay for the training usually. They'll leave because they're supposed to know it all, right? But they do not have the leadership skills. Often they are the problem, right? But they step out of the room. I always remark on that. But sport people will say, oh, well, like Frank Vandenberg, he would say these brilliant sports scientists, and they find themselves in leadership positions. And then they'll say, well, I'm kind of thrust into that role, but I actually do not have the skills I need to be a leader. And yet I find they often do because they've grown up through sport and learned a lot of they just don't know what to call them, or they haven't quite distilled it or translated it, and, but they're all there embedded. And I just have to kind of pull them out and so that they feel they can hang on to them and use them. Brilliant. I agree. I think we're just lacking that. But sport also has this strange model of, the best player is the captain. It doesn't even make any sense.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks. That was wonderful. And great to see your wife up here, Jen. Welcome. And
yes, I noticed that too.
Great to see just so many people joining in. And for those, some had to leave, but we send out this recording, and Duff, I will share the recording, of course, with you and promote it in different ways as well. So great to spend this time. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. Enjoyed that very much.
Gave me lots to think about too. Okay, take care, everybody. Thanks so much, Amara and the gang at Royal Roads for all your support. And thanks everybody for showing up. Take care. Bye.